Brother Jonathan Earl, good to see you. Brother Dan Siegel, good to see you. Anisha, good to see you. Brother Justin, good to see you. Jennifer, good to see you. Cecile, good to see you. Such a beautiful, beautiful congregation here. Hermano Orlando, ¿cómo estás? I want to begin by really honoring what this forum represents. As director of the fellowship program here at the Garrison Institute, this is our first public collective offering. For many of you who might know, we launched a fellowship program in the beginning of the fall, and we have been quietly conspiring and meeting monthly and having these incredible conversations. The fellowship is initially a one-year experience, which will be extended to 2. And we have 11 fellows. For those of you who are interested in learning more about the program, please check our initiatives page and learn more about the program there. I'll just say that we explore 4 central things, 4 small things. One is awareness-based contemplative wisdom. And what does it mean to sit with wisdom that comes from so many different traditions and decipher that in terms of how to make sense at its current historical moment. Secondly, the science of interconnection. So really looking at and playing with and wrestling with what are people in the field saying in terms of hardcore science, in terms of how not just we're all interconnected, but how do we actually maybe even mend some of the division that is very present in our society today. Thirdly, collective healing. So we reflect on and think through what that means. And lastly, generative action. So how does all of that tie into actual action? So each fellow has a project, an inquiry, and they work on that. And as the director and my sister, Jennifer Bloom, we support the birthing of particular projects, initiatives, and thoughts. And today marks the one small reveal of what I think is a masterpiece. So without further ado, let me introduce to you Dr. Sará King. And before I hand the mic over, you can read her bio. And you can see that she is Black girl magic incarnate. You know, she's too humble. So UCLA, although she passed through that institution, although she's been in the room with some of the most powerful thinkers in the field, the woman has a powerful heart. And I just want to say that what you'll see today is a very unique theoretical framework that is very, very tied to particular movements in the academy and in community. You can't take in her theory without thinking about Harriet Tubman in that, without thinking about Frederick Douglass in abolition, without thinking about Fannie Lou Hamer, without thinking about some of the robust Black feminist thinkers. But you also can't take it in without thinking about neuroscience, intergenerational trauma, epigenetic research. So just wanting to acknowledge the robustness of her work. So what we'll do is we'll just sit with Sister Sará and have her gently walk us through this robust theory and experience. And then we'll play with her and talk with her and have some breakout groups. We will take a bio break at the top of the hour or at some point when it feels appropriate. With that being said, I am excited to just pass the mic to Dr. Sará King.
What? Thank you so much for that incredible introduction, Monique and Angel. I'm already feeling so enlivened and invigorated by being here to share in presence and community with all of you. This time together is absolutely a gift. So one thing that I'd like to say is I do have information that I'll be presenting to you all today. But it's really my hope, in the spirit of Dr. Bayo Akamalafe, who is a huge inspiration to me and the entire MUI Community Council and the Garrison Institute. In the spirit of him saying, times are urgent, let us slow down. It is my hope that any of the words that I am presenting or the images that perhaps we can turn towards feeling into where they land inside of our bodies. Because what it is that I'll be presenting today, I don't have any claims around it being truth with a capital T, but rather it's my hope that this information will be pointing in an embodied fashion in the direction of the potential for collective liberation. And so with that, I'll share my screen. So yes, welcome everyone to this presentation through the Garrison Fellowship Forum about my theory for research, facilitation, and healing, the science of social justice. Before we get into the words and the images that will be presented today, I wanted to take a moment and offer up this photo and allow this image. This is an image of me guiding embodied sacred meditation practice for one of my dear friends, Socorro Reynoso, when she was getting ready to open up her mental health care practice in Inglewood. And you will notice that spread across the floor are the photos of her and her ancestors. And so one of the questions that I have for our time together today is, can we begin to feel into the possibility that who we are is, we are beings who live at the nexus of the dreams of our ancestors and the memories of our descendants. And I'll say that one more time. Perhaps we are beings who live at the nexus of the dreams of our ancestors and the memories of our descendants. And if that is the case, what does that mean for our capacity to dream ourselves, to imagine ourselves into a plane of existence that is truly in alignment with our deepest, most heart-centered values? And so, if you will, if it feels compassionate, if it feels supportive to you all, I'd like to invite you to either gently close the eyes or have them lowered about half-mast to feel your feet upon the earth, wherever you are. Maybe it might feel compassionate and connective to place one hand on the heart and the other on the belly. Perhaps allowing the belly to be soft. Perhaps allowing the shoulders to drape loosely about either side of the spine. And if you wish, we can begin our time together with a collective action oriented towards health and integration. And we can take 3 deep, long breaths together. Sensing the power of the group, breathing and feeling with one another. And just asking ourselves, what is the quality of the energy that I brought with me to the space today? Gently, tenderly noticing if there are any particular areas of tightness. And when you notice those areas of tightness, perhaps you may be able to send the healing breath in the direction of those areas of tightness as a tender invitation toward the possibility of opening up with love. And whenever you are ready, if your eyes are closed, beginning to gently open them back up and allow for colors and textures to flood into your awareness. And if it feels good too, you can start to roll the shoulders out a little bit, inviting a little bit of movement. Turning towards this space that we will be co-creating with one another today. So one of the things that I'd like to talk to you about is stemming from my research at UCLA. When I started my PhD program in 2011, I became aware of the fact that there was a movement to introduce mindfulness into public schools in the United States. I was studying and training as a practitioner at Spirit Rock in the Vipassana tradition, and I was also engaged in a 200-hour yoga teacher training practice. And so naturally, these areas of my own embodied and spiritual practices began to filter into my experience of research. And I discovered that there was a shift in policy that actually supported this opening of mindfulness into schools, where a recent emphasis in educational policy had been developed supporting the social and emotional learning processes behind student learning. This was in combination with more traditional and cognitively based learning approaches. And I can't underemphasize how radical it was, but also, when we consider the fact that it took our education system until 2015 to consider deeply that our relationships and our emotions are integral to the process of learning, it can be pretty eye-opening in terms of what we know about the course of the development of what is considered to be educative in our nation. This policy was called the Every Student Succeeds Act, and it contained these new provisions specifically in support of socio-emotional learning. There's an institution called the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning, or CASEL. And in collaboration with many partners across the United States, school districts were then allowed to include one non-academic indicator of school success into their system of measuring accountability. And notice where that lands. Just that phrase, measuring accountability. What does that mean? What does that mean to us? Including any programs or interventions that successfully tackle issues such as student engagement or climate. In a way, this momentum of bringing mindfulness into schools supposedly to support this process of measuring accountability seems to be a little bit reflecting this language around whiteness, as it is very pervasive inside of our schools. But we'll get a little bit more into that later in my presentation. I can also see that there are a couple of people that are in the waiting room if we can allow those community members to join. So I developed in my dissertation what I called critical yoga and meditation practice theory. And I was proposing this critical yoga and meditation practice in order to support the healing of marginalized youth, most specifically Black, Indigenous, POC youth inside of our schools. And this is a quote directly from my dissertation, where I said, student well-being is intimately tied to the socioeconomic disparities that continue to segregate low SES urban students into schools that do not offer them the kind of opportunities they need to succeed. And I'll say here, our schools today in the United States are actually more segregated than they were in 1970. If low SES urban students choose to participate in yoga and meditation interventions, then I argue that these interventions must deliberately engage them from a social justice-based lens in order for the manner of instruction to be truly empowering. The experience of being a racialized person in the United States, or of racism, are experiences that are specifically embodied. Thus, yoga and meditation practices that do not explicitly and critically address this aspect of the lives of low SES students of color risks sending the message that this incredibly salient experience is less than meaningful. And we actually have Dr. Gia Naranjo Rivera with us today on this call, who is another one of the scholars and research scientists here in the United States whose dissertation on peace in schools is actually the next iteration or manifestation of this work of examining critical yoga and meditation practices. So maybe we might hear from her briefly at some point today. But what do I mean by the messages that are being sent by these interventions that do not explicitly or critically address the realities of being racialized? This word racialized, I use very specifically in order to connote that race is something that is applied to us. We are not born into this world with any notions of what that means. And in fact, the racialization process is deeply tied into how it is that we are socialized to understand ourselves and our identities, both within our families and the cultures and communities that we live in, but also it is deeply embedded in the experience of our educational process itself. So another layer of what I mean by the damage that can be done by these interventions is that the experience of being racialized, specifically, I'm focusing in, I'm narrowing down on race in this moment. The experience of being racialized is deeply tied to our experience of intergenerational trauma, which also resides and is emitted from the body in terms of our behavior and our relationships in the world. This is one of my favorite educational tools. It is a map, one could say, of the trauma response. If you look at the very right-hand side of this map, you can see the way in which Ruby Jo Walker, thank you so very much, I hope I get to meet you one day, she's the person who created this map, was able to really delineate for us this flow between the parasympathetic nervous system and the sympathetic nervous system as they are deeply tied into, these are the zones of the body where our trauma response gets emitted into the world. So when it comes to this process of being racialized, and many of you have probably experienced this yourself, particularly when you enter into conversations about race here in the United States. I've had so many people tell me that they go into this sympathetic nervous system state of deactivation, flight or fight, where a lot of emotions like rage, anger, fear, worry, and concern can arise. And thus these emotions, these physiological states from the nervous system, along with their associated emotional states, are being communicated verbally and also within our body language and in the energy that our bodies give off when we are engaged in these spaces of conversation, navigating the embodiment of race. On the other hand, I have also heard a lot of people articulate to me when they're engaged in these conversational spaces around race, that their body might be entering more into a place of overwhelm, that dorsal vagal parasympathetic nervous system activation state, which is more associated with the bodily response of freezing. And I wonder right now, how many of us have participated in a conversation about race or any other emotional conversation or engagement around identity where we have ourselves felt shame, shutdown, numbness, helplessness, or dissociation. In fact, I would say that, just me speaking personally, that this map really illustrates a lot of the emotional roller coaster that I was personally feeling during the previous 4 years of the presidency here in the in the United States, but particularly when I think back to that day of the insurrection on January 6th. I just remember so potently, it felt like my ancestors were screaming out from my body that they had seen this, they had been in this place before. And I could feel this tendency of my body when going into this state of flight or fight or freeze, spinning up narratives and stories around hopelessness and feeling trapped and even preparing for death. This can be some of the incredibly powerful emotional impact that systemic racism and white supremacy can have when we encounter it inside of the body. But there is hope. There is always hope. And that hope is embedded inside of our very nervous systems. As well, our parasympathetic nervous system has the capacity to open us up when we are in that ventral vagal nervous system state to a place of social engagement. Now, social engagement theory was developed by Dr. Stephen Porges, and it really delineates the ways in which the body's physiological nervous system states can open us up when we are feeling connected, when we are feeling safe, when we are feeling oriented to our environment, and we are feeling seen, that we have the capacity to open ourselves up to joy, to groundedness, curiosity, compassion, and indeed, mindfulness. This is the crux of the mindfulness practice. But we have to remember at all times that we cannot dissociate this conversation about the trauma response and intergenerational trauma from the ways in which it is always in conversation with our identity, which is arising at all times from our experience of our bodies. So here is where I break down the science of social justice just a little bit, right? What do I mean by these words? Science, social, justice. I don't want to assume right now that we're all on the same page about that. And so I will just open you up to what it is that I mean by that. And so that hopefully we can generate some juicy conversation around what this means for all of you. So what I mean by science is the systematic study of the patterns of arising phenomena within our individual and collective awareness by means of investigation, measurement, and inquiry. Now, I'm going to get a little bit unusual here and say that yes, we can engage in the work of science through the use of the various disciplines that have been invented around very specific quantitative and qualitative investigation and measurement. But there is a certain aspect of our lived experience which is deeply internal, it is felt, it is private, no one will ever fully know all the things that are going on inside of us. And so, what I mean by inquiry is also that through contemplative practices, we ourselves are engaged in what could be typified as a scientific process. This process of inquiry that we engaged in when we are connecting the body and the mind and the breath and just really deeply feeling into this experience of awareness and consciousness is a scientific practice all in and of itself. By social, I mean the relational experience of our shared interbeing, right? Interdependence, so important here. But perhaps most importantly of all within my description of the science of social justice is the way that I am defining justice itself. I define justice as loving awareness in action. Loving awareness in action. And part of the reason why I'm using this definition is because for me, I've had to really interrogate for myself what social justice is not. So if loving awareness in action is not present, then it is not that. And this is partially my response to, some of these conversations that were coming up where, for instance, white supremacist nationalists are being compared directly to Black Lives Matter protesters. And they're saying, well, it's pretty much the same thing. They're out there and they're marching in the streets and they just want their rights. And it's like, no. Let's get back to the level of intention here, people. And there is nothing about loving awareness in action that has anything to do with white supremacy. That's my opinion. But justice is something that I want to speak of right now as a North Star. Many of you have probably heard of the experience of African American slaves here in the United States when they were in bondage in the South. They had no idea where they were within the geography of the United States, but what they did have was this unbreakable connection to the sky, to the stars, right? And so they looked to that North Star in order to seek their freedom and their escape from bondage. So one of the things I'd like to say is that I feel as though the role of imagination and intentionality can really not be understated when we are developing an understanding of what it means to shape the container of our inner landscape and our relationship with the world. So anytime that we are feeling into injustice in the world and the pain that that provokes inside of the body, the emotional pain, the physical pain, the psychological pain, that we have inside of ourselves these North Stars. This is just a small selection, a small sample. But we have the capacity to offer up in any given moment gentleness, patience, vulnerability, humility, tenderness, and radical friendship. And radical friendship starts first with the way in which we are able to offer radical friendship, unconditional love towards ourselves, and then pour forth from that into the world. And all of these give us the power to shift effectively the neurobiology of our own behavior and mental health. It gives us the power to shift family and community dynamics, and it will map out the road in the direction of a true experience of compassionate global citizenship. These are what I call the emergent tenants of the science of social justice. And I call them emergent because the science of social justice is emerging from all of our experience of awareness. The science of social justice says that social justice and well-being are inextricably linked. They are one and the same thing. We cannot have one without the other. It names consciousness building or the intentional cultivation of systems-based awareness. Write that one down, systems-based awareness in individuals and communities as fundamental to healing the relationship between our internal and external ecosystem of well-being. It names well-being and integration, or the lack thereof, as a biopsychosocial, meaning it ties together the physiological, the psychological, and the social. Epigenetic, meaning it ties together this relationship between the environment and our genes. And it is intersectional and intergenerational as a phenomenon, with the same positive or negative impacts on local and global communities. It names the scientific fields which study well-being: psychology, neuroscience, medicine, public health, and the embodied practices of well-being: contemplative practices, or art, music, dance, poetry, nutrition, as these relate to the interplay between identity, geography, and ecology. All of these provide us with a significant piece of the roadmap to individual and collective well-being and healing. It requires the use of contemplative practices that are grounded in the conscious, embodied exploration of, and I highlighted this on purpose, what I call, this might not be new, but I'm calling it past, present, future time. Because we are beings, remember, it is quite possible that we are beings who exist at the nexus of the dreams of our ancestors from the past and the memories of our descendants from the future. We are all of that within the present time, moment of time, and we have access to actually feel into that, and how intergenerational trauma arises in our relationships with ourselves, with others, and is always informed and shaped by the history of violence, othering, and systemic oppression. I have a few more tenets that I'll go through. You might want to take a screenshot of this because I'm not going to go through them all in the interest of time. But one of the things that I think is very important to name is that intergenerational trauma can potentially shift towards post-traumatic growth. We can grow within and through the trauma if we name how it arises in the body, and we reframe this trauma around the relationship between embodiment, awareness, loving awareness in action, justice, grounded in intentional healing and imagination. Another thing that I'd like to name is that within the science of social justice, it names whiteness and white supremacy as trauma-based manifestations of hyper-individuality, an experience of life which is decoupled from interdependence. Interdependence is, I will name that as a truth with a capital T, but we have to connect to that reality. And whiteness and white supremacy are linked phenotypically, meaning in the appearance, those who appear to be white, and behaviorally to the systemic racism which white identified people in the United States, Europe, and abroad have inherited. This is an intergenerational trauma which they have inherited via the socialization processes inherent within institutionalization of racism. And so this is to say that I am not interested in any framework of social justice which seeks to dehumanize through violence any group of people just because their bodies look a certain way. So there is no healing, positive path forward in demonizing people because of the intergenerational traumas that have been passed down to them. But they do have to be named. They do have to be framed. And when we name whiteness and white supremacy as an intergenerational phenomena of trauma, what that means is that our capacity to heal this lies within the nervous system itself. So what we need, what I want to challenge the entire scientific community, especially neuroscientists around, is that right now we have literally no way of describing the intergenerational trauma that white identified people carry within their bodies because we have no nervous system based language around it. people of color, the BIPOC community, and our traumas are studied all day, every day, but there's no language around this. And so this is one of the ways in which I want to lovingly disrupt. I want to lovingly trouble the waters. And I also want to name that internalized white supremacy and oppression as a form of intergenerational trauma itself can manifest in the thoughts, behaviors, and relationships of BIPOC people as violence or othering that enforces assimilation, patriarchy, heteronormativity, it goes on. So just because you come from a Black, Indigenous, just because you are a person of color does not mean that you are somehow exempt from the existence of intergenerational violence inside of your own nervous system. I'm peeping the time. Okay, and now, let's see, I'm not sure why. So a little bit of, can you all see me still? Okay, perfect. So the way that I have developed the science of social justice has been deeply within conversation with my mentor, Dr. Dan Siegel's disciplinary framework of interpersonal neurobiology. And this is very important here. So this comes directly from his book, The Developing Mind, which I had the pleasure of helping to edit the most recent third version of. And these are some of the things that he says that I think will really set us up for some juicy conversation, and also will really set us up for the systems-based awareness maps that I will be presenting to you in just a moment. So we really have to ask ourselves, right? Where does this phenomenon of race come from? Where does racism come from? Where does violence, intergenerational trauma, how can we identify possibly a baseline by which to cultivate an understanding of what is arising within the experience of being human on this planet? And what I came to was mind and awareness. Mind and awareness, all phenomena are arising from this, right? So he says a core aspect, what is the mind? A core aspect of the human mind is that it is an embodied and relational process, regulating the flow of energy and information within the brain and between brains, right? So this is to say that the mind is a phenomenon that is not just limited to what Dan likes to say, the skin encased body. It exists within and it exists between. And it is formed and constantly shaped by these relational processes, right? The second core aspect of mind, and he names 3 of them in the book, but you'll have to buy it and read it if you want to get all of them. The second core aspect of mind is the phenomenon of being aware, of having an internal sense of knowing that is part of what we call consciousness. So right there, he is naming one of our most incredible superpowers. Awareness is what it is. It just exists. But we as humans have the power to be aware that we are aware. We have the power to be aware that we are aware by directing our attention in that general direction. That is part of what makes us so impactful on this planet. He names the mind as an emergent property of the body and relationships created within internal neurophysiological processes, like we discussed in that trauma map, right? And relational experiences. In other words, he says the mind is a process that emerges from the distributed nervous system, which extends throughout the entire body, and also from the communication patterns that occur within relationships. So you can then begin to feel into this concept that, yes, you are having this experience of you, the individual being, with your individual nervous system and your individual intergenerational trauma, but you are also situated within a collective nervous system, right? And so in that way, we can begin to dismantle what Dan often calls the lie of the separate self, right? We can really feel into our togetherness through the way that he's discussing this. He also names regulation as resulting from integration, the ways in which we can regulate our interior states, we can regulate our nervous system response. And part of our capacity to regulate our internal nervous system response to stimuli that's coming at us in the world is in this capacity to pause and slow down and be with. He says, when our relationships are integrated, they are the most flexible and adaptable. And then lastly, he says that the underlying possibility is that the power of awareness can be used to intentionally cultivate integration in our relational and neural lives. The power of awareness. Now, I first encountered Dan's work a little over a decade ago, and I have literally been pondering it and rolling it around and digesting it in my mind ever since. But what I really needed was a visual. And so in partnership with, I was really held in this process by the Garrison Fellowship. I would love to present to you all now what I have created, which is, what I call a systems-based awareness map. And I'll just give you all a moment in silence to slow down. I'd like to invite you, if it feels natural, if it feels compassionate, to take a few deep breaths. And before I go into any descriptors, just take this in. Remembering that we never pick up a map and mistake it for the actual place. So this is more a tool to point us in a certain direction. In the center, so this is a map that is a tool for us to be able to visualize the relationship between pure awareness, our experience of internal embodied awareness, individual awareness, and collective awareness, and the impact that healing and integrating trauma or violence and unintegrated trauma can potentially have upon the entire system. And one of the things that I want to name is that right now, this model is two-dimensional, but it is my hope that it will actually become developed to be interactive and deeply personalized. So we start in the very center at pure awareness. And pure awareness is the place that the plane of possibility, what Dan calls the plane of possibility, or the space which includes the potential of everything that could possibly emerge into reality. It lies within the zone. And more importantly, one of the things that he says is that love and compassion and belonging are some of the felt experiences that exist within this state of pure awareness, right? This is something that has been talked about within countless different indigenous traditions around the world. From there, we expand into this field of internal awareness. This is the place where our memories, our emotions, our feelings, sensations, and thoughts arise within the body. The next rung, the purple layer of awareness, is identity awareness. And you will notice that I have situated it in between internal and body awareness, because it is a lens through which we are constantly interpreting our memories, emotions, feelings, sensations, and thoughts. It is housed within our awareness of being an individual body. The next rung, the pink layer, is the layer of body awareness, which is where our experience, it's the physiological dimension where our experience of vitality or disease arise. And this is very, very important, because I think that a lot of people, in my experience, are really looking to develop a way to understand, well, what is this relationship between my experience of myself as an individual and my experience of collective self out there in the world? So the following layer is your awareness of yourself as enacted. This is the layer of agency. This is the layer of awareness that says, yes, here I am in this individual body, and I can be still and I can be here by myself, or I can act upon the world. And this is the zone where behavior, speech, relationship, movement, and proprioception arise, right? How we know where we are within the world. The final layer being that of awareness of collective self as enacted. So agency is arising at all times within the field of collective self. And this is where environment, society, and culture are housed. You will also notice that inside of the pink layer of the physiological dimension, I have included a dotted orange line, which refers to interoception. So interoceptive processes are how our brain constructs for us the reality of what we feel is going on inside of our bodies. And then the purple dotted line at the very edge between body awareness and body as enacted upon the world is exteroception. And exteroception is how the brain tells us about all the information that we're receiving from outside of the body, and then it relays it throughout our experience of conscious awareness. You will also notice that I have these arrows that are inputs and outputs. And one of the things that I'm trying to demonstrate with this, although it can be a little bit tough to do visually, and this is part of what I would really love your feedback on. I mean, I would love feedback on literally anything, but I am trying to exemplify the fact that there is constantly a feedback loop that is occurring between all of these layers of awareness. So in this visual right here, it seems as though the barriers between the layers of awareness are impermeable, but that's not true. They're completely permeable. They're constantly in relationship with one another. And one of the things that this demonstrates is, and I'll use a real world example here, when we look at the insurrection that happened in the Capitol, when we look at these examples of institutionalized racism and white supremacy, this is an event, for example, that occurred within the realm, we could say, of environment, society, and culture. It was an event of violence stemming from unintegrated trauma. And it created a feedback loop where it fundamentally shifted our awareness of our sense of agency in the world. It impacted us in terms of our feelings of vitality, in terms of the stress that it brought about within our nervous systems, potentially impacting the manifestation of diseases itself. But very importantly, oh, and now I'm noticing one of the things that I did not break down is that the way in which we understood that event was filtered through the lens of our identity awareness. And you'll see that on the side in the key, I came up with a term for identity. It's an acronym, which I know that Dan loves. And the acronym is IEI. Identity is the intergenerational epigenetics of intersectionality. I know that's a lot, but I'll break it down. The experience of identity within our awareness is always informed by our ancestors. It is always informed by this relationship between epigenetics, the environment, and our genes and how they express themselves. And it is deeply intersectional, meaning all the different facets of our identity, which have been handed down to us, our race, our class, our gender, etc., are always enfolded upon one another and informing the ways in which we view the world. So in a very real way, when violence comes at us from this realm of the collective self, it always filters down and has an impact, right, upon our experience of being in an individual body. However, we are totally empowered because we can also engage in healing practices and the integration of trauma that includes our internal awareness, that includes, does not leave out our identity. right? And any and all of the healing that we are able to manifest inside of these individual bodies in relationship with other individual bodies then becomes an output back into the world and impacts the collective. It is always in relationship with one another. So I had a conversation with Dan about this model. And one of the things that he mentioned that we were in conversation about was we were really working on this concept of like, how are we locating this relationship between awareness and internal individual awareness and collective awareness? And one of the things that he mentioned to me is that the experience of individual awareness lies above that of pure awareness. And it's when we are applying our attention to the plane of possibility that we create a feedback loop. And that feedback loop then is informing our awareness. It is expanding or contracting our awareness in any of the other subsequent domains. So after we had that conversation, I decided to come up with an additional map. This is a map that is deeply inclusive of all of the different layers of awareness that I previously presented to you, except this map is delving a little bit more deeply into this relationship between mind and awareness. So the plane of possibility is still at the center. It's still at the heart of it all. But all of those different layers of individual awareness, I have encapsulated into this one layer called awareness of inner self, or the layer of mind where we perceive ourselves as an individual being. The outer layer, which contains this layer of our sense of self as agentive and the collective, is the inter self, the layer of mind in which we perceive ourselves as part of a collective being. And Dan, if you're on this call and you have something to say about the way in which I phrased that, I would love to have your feedback, but this is just my first stab at that. But one of the things that we talked about was a possible definition of social justice, in which justice, when defined as loving awareness in action, is when the inner and the inter are fully integrated within our holistic experience of awareness, right? So this is to say that it is not just good enough to do our contemplative practices, our embodied practices, and just be focused in on the healing of ourselves. We have to be conscientiously creating these feedback loops between our awareness of self as individual and our awareness of self as collective in order to dismantle the lie of the separate self. And so with that, Dr. Angel Acosta, I would love to invite you into the conversation at this point. I have both of the maps up for us to bear witness to side by side, and I am just incredibly humbled by this opportunity to present to you what is the first iteration of the Systems-Based Awareness Map. And I would love any comments or feedback that you have thus far.
Yes. Well, allow me to feel into what most of us, if not all of us, are feeling. And just thank you. Thank you for the intellectual, emotional, and physical labor that came through you to get this done. What comes to me immediately is that the trauma that is experienced collectively, right now we're experiencing so much collective trauma, the pandemic, racial injustice, economic disparity, ecological imbalance, that for many of us, it's disorienting. One, it's probably easier to just turn away from it. And what you're doing is the important work of mapping possibly a systems approach to give us a little clarity in terms of understanding what's happening. So just thank you. Thank you. So I'm just really grateful. I have some thoughts. I do want to bring in some audience participation just for a little bit, and then we can kind of
coming to a place where you can really feel the connection between your feet and the earth, if possible. I'd like to invite you to either close the eyes or to have them just halfway shut, using what's called a soft gaze, directing the gaze without staring, just a couple of inches in front of the knees. If the hands are clasped, you can experiment with having them resting gently upon the thighs if that feels compassionate to you. And just imagining for a moment that there is a golden ball of light that is housed directly in the center of the body, in the center of the belly. And this golden ball of light, you can imagine a golden string that's coming directly from that golden ball up through the center line of the body and out through the top of the head. And that might allow you to come to a posture that is supportive of your practice. If you do not wish to practice with us today, then I invite you to simply be in the resonant field that is created by this experience. And if it feels all right, we can engage in another act of solidarity with one another and take 3 deep, long breaths in and out of the nostrils, if that is available to you. And beginning to notice how the body responds almost automatically when we begin to engage in a little bit of slow breathing. And when you're finished with those inhales and exhales, returning back to a natural cadence and rhythm of breath. And simply taking the entire body into your awareness, directing your attention, and asking yourself, again, what is the energy that you've carried with you into the space? How are you holding and in relationship to the body in this moment? And you may notice a variety of thoughts arising from moment to moment. And see if, as you notice those thoughts, you can play with the visual that you are standing on a train platform, watching the trains go by, and your thoughts and sensations are the trains. You are the observer and the witness of your thoughts passing by, just allowing them to be. And if at any point in this practice you notice that you've become hooked by a particular thought, then you may notice that you have stepped onto the train and you're riding inside of it. And you can invite yourself to gently step off of the train back onto the train platform, returning to watching the thoughts go by as an observer. It may be helpful to return to the breath or sound within the room that you're in to anchor you back to your experience. Taking another deep breath in and out here, flowing the breath all the way from the top of the head down to the bottom of the feet. And perhaps directing our attention to the bottoms of our feet and noticing, is there a difference between the way that the right foot and the left foot meet with the earth? This is a gentle practice of attuning ourselves to the earth, to a sense of collective awareness, to the zone of the environment. And if it feels compassionate, with each inhale and exhale breath, you may imagine that there are what I call spirit roots that are flowing down from the bottoms of the feet from your experience of being an individual body. And with each breath, these spirit roots grow just a little bit deeper into the earth, into the environment. And with each breath, we can cultivate relationship with the earth. And if there's anything in this moment that you feel is no longer serving you, you can even imagine flowing that with the breath down through the feet and these roots of spirit, kindly asking the earth if they would be willing to take that energy from us. And with each inhale, drawing nourishment from the earth into the body. Let's be with that visual for just a few moments, seeing in our mind's eye, with each exhale breath, exhaling out that which no longer serves us, and inhaling whatever nourishment we may need. How does the feeling of the body shift when we consciously connect our awareness to the environment as an extension of ourselves? And now shifting your attention and awareness, traveling up the right and left leg, taking note of any tension that may arise there. Perhaps allowing that tension to flow down the legs and the feet into the earth. And then shifting your attention and awareness to the muscles of the belly. Noticing here if you've been holding them tight toward the spine. Taking another deep breath here. See if you're able to invite a sense of relaxation to the muscles of the belly. By feeling into our capacity to let go of any tightness there, we can model vulnerability as strength. And within this space of the belly, if it feels both safe and compassionate, we can return to the visual of a bright, glowing, golden orb of light. And this golden orb of light contains messages communication, wisdom from both the ancestors who have dreamed us into being and our descendants who remember us into being. I'd like to invite you to see if there's any colors, textures that arise for you as messages. Maybe there are images, or perhaps you are simply having an experience of the individual self. Whatever your experience is, see if you can feel into a sense that who you are is an ever-evolving story, experience of awareness that is being fed and nourished by your spirit roots deep within the earth and through the messages of your ancestors and descendants. And whatever feelings or colors or textures you've connected with, see if it's possible to begin to breathe those throughout the heart center. Expanding this golden ball of light up through the heart. Perhaps beginning to feel into shining and radiating this light out all around you. And maybe we can ask here if there is anything that there's any way that we can feel into compassion for the experiences of our ancestors and how they have shaped us. Taking another deep breath here and imagining what it would be like to offer up the color or texture of compassion to the ancestors. How might that shift our relationship to our feeling of embodiment? Now bringing the entire body back into your mind's awareness. Gently observing as you breathe. Has anything shifted in your experience of embodiment? As you have conscientiously cultivated a connection to the ancestors and your descendants. What is being communicated through your being? Perhaps taking a moment to give thanks for this body and the bodies of everyone in our community. When you are ready, you Beginning to slowly maybe wiggle the toes and the fingers. Ever so slowly and gently opening up the eyes without staring, just allowing color and texture from the external environment to merge with your awareness. Perhaps beginning to move the head and the neck, or the shoulders around, beginning to activate a bit more of an active connection to the external environment. And seeing if there are any words that were communicated within your being. Perhaps we can take just 2 minutes to write down anything in particular that was arising.